overwhelming amount of things that we feel we need to do, and an inability, or the feeling that we have an inability to cope with what's required of us. Has anyone here had any experience with crisis, critical incidents, stress debriefings, anything like that? Awesome, great. Okay, perfect. It's been a busy time since the storm. I've been nonstop since the storm for crisis stuff, which is, I love the work. I love working with the persons affected and helping them get through it. And the magic that we present to those that we work with is not to fix what happened, because we can't. What we offer that person that we're talking to is some level of alleviation of what they're feeling. Maybe some change in how they are perceiving things, because at the moment that they're distressed and that we're distressed, we oftentimes think that we can't get through it. So I will give you some magic, for lack of better words, some magic statement to help that person that you're talking to or working with to get past that particular distress or feeling. Let's move forward here. I'm going to move forward myself, just so I can see the slides. All right, so crisis involves, can I do this? All right, come over. Great. This is much better for me, much better for you. All right, so no one who sees a disaster is untouched by it. So even if your home wasn't affected, even if your property wasn't affected, someone that you know was affected. You're also driving through your used to be familiar streets, and now you have to get used to a new normal, right? So the trees aren't the same. Some of the landscape isn't the same. So that comfortable ride you used to take home in your non-affected neighborhood is affected. And that level of comfort that we sometimes utilize by driving to familiar areas to decompress is no longer available. So you yourself, even though you may have been unscathed in terms of property damage or physical harm to you, thank goodness, you're still affected by it, right? So if you're subject of disaster traumas, there's the individual and the community. Communities, of course, are going to be the ones that we're going to be working with. The Puerto Rican community, perhaps other islanders might call, some Caribbean islanders might call as well. There's going to be, it's projected to be some sort of exodus coming into Florida as well to help them process their lack of electricity, lack of water in some areas. The Coast Guard has already brought some of its, we're working with them as well, has brought some of their support families here to the area to help them through the process, because they also have children, and they started school, I think, on Monday, just to normalize the process for them. So most people also pull together and function after disaster, but that effectiveness is diminished because they're also impacted. We're going to go in a couple slides forward. We're going to talk about how crisis, there's a honeymoon phase, there's a disaster phase, there's a couple of phases that we all go through together, and it'll make a little bit more sense in terms of what happens to a community when they're going through this process. Everyone pulls together. We all remember 9/11. Some of you may not have been born yet. But something horrible happened on 9/11, look it up. We had a lot of other disasters that happened, and for a brief moment, we all pulled together. There's no differences in gender, there's no differences in political views, we all pull together. And that sometimes kind of dies down, and then we go back to whatever the normal is that we had before the storm, right? And of course, stress and grief are very common reactions to the abnormal situation that they're going through. And the stress is an important factor. I'm not sure if I have a stress is an important factor because they may have already been experiencing stress, but because of the storms, because of the damage, because of the areas that are involved with the disastrous stuff, they're going to have chronic stress. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how it affects our body biology. Okay? So reactions often relate to survival and recovery issues. So sometimes you'll see people coming to a line for goods, for foods, and become quite possessive of as much as they can because of what they're going through. And for us, it oftentimes feels like they're being selfish, they're not considering other people, but when you're in a moment of desperation, and you have family members who are needing particular supplies, and you don't have the means to go to an ATM machine because there's no lights, you don't have the means to be able to go to the Walmart or the store in the corner to buy these because there's no supplies, desperation kicks in. So oftentimes you'll see that people almost never seek out mental health services when they're in a crisis because they're busy being in a crisis, right? And they're busy resolving everything on their own. So what occurs is that oftentimes irritability is building up, other things are happening at the same time, but they don't come to us mental health clinicians until things have really gotten nice and toasty. And then we have to repair all that kind of right, and work through and kind of take it apart and rebuild it for them in a way that makes sense. Survivors are also oftentimes known to reject any type of services. So I suspect that our hotline will be very successful in assistance, but the people that mostly need someone to talk to probably won't be calling. Because oftentimes they go into a reclusive, isolated state just because they need to regroup and kind of make sense of things. So oftentimes we won't be able to reach everyone, but if you reach one person and give them some nice tools, they can perhaps reach that person that isn't brave enough or ready enough to call in, okay? And when we provide any sort of assistance on the line, on the hotline, it's going to be more supportive than anything. So you're not going to be diagnosing, you're not going to be pointing out major symptoms, and you might be referring if you see that the need is deeper, right? But this isn't a time for you to provide any sort of therapeutic intervention on the phone. Okay? So here's that phase of disaster I was talking about. So we have the pre-disaster time and the warning, right? If any of you watched the news during the storms, right? It was really pointless because it's coming here, it's coming there, we don't know it's coming this way, it may be that way, we're not sure, it's coming through the middle, through the side. So I would love to become a meteorologist. Because clearly I have to have no science available to me, rather than just pointing and looking at models, right? So we boarded up here, we boarded up there. Some people were leaving from here to go to the West Coast, and they got slammed. So in Florida alone, this is pretty distressing, getting prepared for, right? So chances are that the next storm that comes for the West Coast of Florida, for example, here locally for us, they're gonna prepare. For the East Coast that have very minimal stuff, it's not going to hit us. So we have to be cautious to also educate our communities, educate ourselves included, to make sure that whenever there's a warning of some sort, that we take it literally. Okay? And we're having some wonderful supporters. Now this is great. You're going to get this on your phone call, so just bear with me. This is all rehearsed, okay? I promise. So you have the impact of the storm, right? And then after a storm, everyone's heroic. Most people are heroic. They're out taking limbs off, helping people, calling people into their homes. Did anyone here get kind of sort of rescued from a no power outage, or a power outage rather, by a relative? Right? Everyone's heroic. And that wonderful, heroic acceptance of you lasts very brief, because we also are used to our normal. And so if you ever are in a situation where you receive guests coming into your home to help them, or you're a guest in someone's home, let me remind you to please bring enough rations for you to be able to not have to consume theirs. And it's not the Ritz-Carlton with concierge service. This is crisis mode, and you need to assist and help so that it doesn't become taxing for your family member. Okay. So then we have the heroic phase, we have the honeymoon phase where everyone's together, and then you get disillusioned. Then power doesn't come fast enough. In Florida, there was about 5 million homes that were without power. By day 8 or 9, I think just 18,000, they're important, but just 18,000 were without power. And for a week and a half, that's a pretty good restoration of power with all the damage that happened, all the damage that occurred, all the trees that were down. In Florida alone, they had 25,000 contracted workers come down. But once it hit the state of Florida, there was no gas all the way down, right? So they would run out of gas, they had to get special tankers. It was a complicated event, but I think, and of course if you had lights for more than 7 days, you're not too happy, but we did pretty good as a state. I think we were pretty prepared for this one, and it was the largest one we ever had. So then you're disillusioned, food doesn't come fast enough, family doesn't, because a lot of families had power and didn't invite you, or invite the people that didn't have power to come over. Even though you said, I don't have power, and yeah, well, that sucks. Yeah. And then, we're watching a movie, can we call you later? Yeah, so oftentimes understand that a lot of this is going to be coming in this area. And when you get disillusioned and that honeymoon phase wears out, what comes after that? Right, someone said irritability, right? Did you hear? Okay, irritability, right? A lot of emotional reactions to things. We're tired, we're hungry, we're hot, we have to take cold showers, and no one ever wants to take a cold shower. So the fact of the matter is a lot of stuff is going on and we emotionally respond to it. So then we go to the grieving process. And we all are familiar, most of us are familiar with grieving. We have the denial, we have the anger, we have the depression, the bargaining, and then the eventual acceptance. I tweak the grieving process a little bit with my clients, and for the acceptance part, I say that we adapt. Because we sometimes don't accept that loss, even if we were expecting it. So I tell people that we kind of adapt to the loss. We don't fully accept the loss. If that makes any sense. So in the process of working with callers calling in, it might be something you want to keep in mind. Then eventually we go into the reconstruction phase, and everything then becomes new or newer. And ecologically, as an ecosystem, Mother Nature takes care of herself, and she recycles and redecorates and put things here and there. And we, as the recipient of that ecosystem, oftentimes then have to build based on our experiences. So I'm hoping for Puerto Rico, they're going to have a much stronger electrical grid after all this, a much stronger building code, perhaps more things in place. And I hope that the things that are in place grow old in a manner because they never have a storm like this again, ever. However, changes will come in this reconstruction phase, which gives us a chance to kind of start over again and start fresh. And that's the magic also of counseling. We give people a chance to start over again. Right? And every morning we wake up, there's another chance to do it. So, phases again: pre-disaster, impact phase, heroic phase, honeymoon phase, disillusionment, and reconstruction. So let's go through the pre-disaster phase, right? Sometimes there's no warnings. The earthquake in Mexico had little warning. The storm and the hurricane Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico had warning, but even then, how do you evacuate a whole island of 3 million plus people, right? So with disasters with no warnings, there's a feeling of vulnerability that remains, and a sense of pending doom, right? It's part of trauma, right? And we do a lot of work with trauma. We don't realize sometimes we're doing it, but there's a lot of work with trauma that's involved in this type of feeling, vulnerability. There's a lack of security, not knowing what to expect, and if you're able to manage whatever may come. Fears about the future, loss of control, because sometimes, people, oh, we have money to get through it, we have enough rations to get through something. But if you have rations for a week, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm a little bit stressed, I tend to want to eat a little bit more. So all that hurricane food, that you had rationed out for about a week and a half, about 3 days later, it's gone. Yeah. Right? So then, all that's left is the healthy stuff that you were avoiding, right? So you have to kind of torture yourself, right? So there's an inability of a person that had a disaster or was a victim of a disaster with no warning, also an inability to protect themselves and their family. And sometimes you're okay being in a hot house for 3 weeks, but you don't want your child to be in a hot house for 3 weeks, or a relative that you care for. So oftentimes if you have a child with special needs, or you're in that sandwich generation where you're kind of taking care of a child and an aging relative, you're caring more for them than you are for yourself. So oftentimes that feeling of not being able to protect them is quite frustrating, and it changes a person in terms of their responses, right? So let's say that you have warning. A lot of people feel guilty and blame themselves for not having heeded the warnings, and that happens to a lot of people here in Florida. Maybe a lot of families in Puerto Rico might feel this way. Not that they should, but it's just a natural consequence to having gone through a storm that you were warned of. Okay, so in the impact phase, it's usually the very shortest phase of this disaster response that we're talking about. And it has a big range of intense emotions, from shock to over panic. And you see that sometimes, there was a lady, and while it seems like a joke, it wasn't. There was a lady who called the call center in Florida Power and Light when I was there, very nervous because she had some emergencies and she couldn't find the 911 number on the phone. And I know it sounds like a joke, I'm walking into a joke, but she was so distressed, she was so panicked, she couldn't remember how to call that number. But she was able to call the Florida Power and Light number, which is a full 7-number digit, right? So oftentimes what seems bizarre, you'll find occurring. So in your work with the caller calling in, understand that they're in a different state of emotional arousal than you are. And oftentimes things will make sense. There's a lot of fear and isolation. Oftentimes in Puerto Rico, there was no communication for a long time with anybody. So it was assumed people were okay, but there was no confirmation. people started resorting to the old shortwave radios. I wasn't going anywhere, by the way. But shortwave radios resulted in a great amount of information that brought a lot of reassurance and peace to a lot of people with their family members. There's a lot of anxiety that comes, a lot of stun in this organization. We talked about that with that caller that couldn't find the 9/11 number. A lot of confusion and disbelief that this could possibly happen. That shock that we sometimes are all familiar with in the grieving process. And of course, there's a sense of self-preservation. And we'll do what we can to self-preserve it. That's our biological way of handling things. And I was just somewhere before coming here, and thank you for waiting for me. One of our first responses from birth that we're trained to feel is fear. And it keeps us, it's our survival technique. So the amygdala goes off when there's some sort of stress or some unfamiliar. And fear is the first thing we all feel. We mitigate it with other things and other techniques, but certainly fear is something that we fear. And if you feel, and if fear is something you have with no provisions to be able to kind of mitigate it, it becomes overwhelming and get that panic and chronic stress of the problem. The needs for someone in the impact phase, that very short phase when they impacted with a disaster or a storm, is the explanation of the incident. What happened? What happened? You know, and where it happened, and who was affected. And these slides I will make available. So if you will, in the sheet that's going to be going around with the sign-in, if you will please indicate like an email address sheet you're comfortable with us sending information, I will be more than happy to make sure these get to you. We also have, they also have the needs for safety of the old Maslow's hierarchy, which we've all learned since bachelor's, AA level psychologists. Right? So basic physical needs is the most important to them. Of course, a hierarchy. And support and caring. Sometimes just listening is what they need. Because oftentimes they call places and before the person's finished their sentence, they're receiving some sort of direction. Sometimes you just want to be heard. And it might be your 47th phone call of someone telling you that they had no lights. But you have to be as attentive the first time, then the 57th time, the 47th time, right? So the heroic phase is where we kind of evacuate and maybe go find that closet where you could be safe in case something was happening around you. You didn't know what was going to particularly occur. And this heroic phase, we also get a lot of family separation. Not just from your biological nucleus family, but you get separated from your cousins, your grandparents, other extended family members that you don't have contacts with. And if your home was destroyed, you're thinking, while you were safe, you're thinking maybe they didn't make it. So you get this period of time when you don't know what's happening. There's high level of activity and very low level of productivity during the time of a heroic phase. Adrenaline is what drives you. And adrenaline is one of the two major hormones that happens during a stressful moment. You get the adrenaline and the cortisol. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Adrenaline gets recycled into your body. It goes to your nervous system. Right? The cortisol does not get recycled. It just lingers and damages. So I will teach you something to offer your callers to be able to help them decompress and get that cortisol out of your system. And maybe you can get your cortisol out of your system. Risk assessment might be impaired at the moment of a heroic phase because no one's going to admit it. They just need to save. And so this is not the time to intervene. And no one will call you in this phase anyway. So the honeymoon phase, right? It lasts just a few weeks. Everyone's, singing Kumbaya all together and they're fixing and pulling limbs out of each other's neighbor's yard. And then 4 weeks into or after the storm, if someone parks in your lawn, but during a storm, everything is okay, right? So you're clearing limbs. Didn't you see neighbors in your neighborhoods and maybe just helping each other, people that never talked, helping get limbs out and maybe helping an older person getting some stuff repaired. But a couple weeks into it, game's over, right? We're back to normal, don't park on normal, right? So a lot of community bonding occurs in this honeymoon phase, and we're kind of experiencing some of that now, which is great. Hopefully we could prolong that a little bit and at least give them a venue and a way to feel connected, even though they're an ocean away, they're still connected to us here. And this is a great phase and an opportunity to build rapport, have relationships with providers in your neighborhood, with resources, the affected people, and stakeholders that are involved. When Pulse happened about a year and several months ago, there was a lot of people that came out right after the actual event. And for about a week, they had about 90 different agencies providing support and talking about what was going on. A month after Pulse, there was very few providers available. And most importantly, there was very, very few providers that spoke Spanish that could work with the population that was affected, and the remaining surviving family members. So hopefully some of you will be inspired to finish your studies and get licensed, and maybe, if you speak Spanish, also consider moving to the Orlando area. Great attractions in this area, great place. But it'll certainly be a wonderful service to provide that community to have that availability of a Spanish-speaking clinician. So in the disillusionment phase, stress and fatigue take a toll. We get tired. And for those of you who are studying in university life, and which is really no life, it's an oxymoron because you're studying all the time and working and studying, right? You know what fatigue does to you. Add to that the stressor of a storm. Add to that the fact that your home has no power to be able to study, to read in comfort, that you might not have provision. So our colleagues, our student colleagues, and the Puerto Rico campus, and the staff and faculty there, are fatigued and don't have a way to kind of remedy that fatigue. So they're just in a chronic state of stress, right? And we'll talk about that and what that does to the body. Optimism turns to discouragement. So when a person calls in, what you don't want to say is, it'll all get better. Just, time heals all wounds, because if you were in an air-conditioned office space, they have been without power for maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, their kids are hungry, they may have an insulin-dependent family member that can't get the right insulin because there's no refrigeration for it. Simple things that we might take quite for granted, they're going through, and they keep going through. So what they don't need is some Pollyanna type of response from us at the call center. It's just oftentimes listening and kind of reiterating what they're saying. They might, unfortunately, increase substance abuse and substance use during this time because they want to just numb what's going on. And what does alcohol do to the system? It's a what? It's a depressant. Good. Give them all an A, whoever, if you're instructor you're here, you should get bonus points. So is marijuana. It's a depressant. And it affects our frontal lobe area, our impulse control. So you're going to get a lot of unusual behaviors. And unfortunately, that's where most people have learned and habituated themselves to kind of dealing with stressors. There's a lot of it now. And it's hot. There was a person on the West Coast, she said that she didn't buy water, but she bought a lot of beer because it was water and beer. Thinking, that's great. However, it's not necessarily what you need for a storm, right? And alcohol also has a lot of your internal organs, and it creates much more problems. Today, she's getting separated from her storms. So, not related to the storm, just the storm was the last straw. So, I'm sure the beer didn't help. So, in any case, larger communities, like more metropolitan areas, go back to business as usual, and then the other areas feel forgotten. And oftentimes we forget to help those that are close to us, not too far from us. And so it's important for us to remember those remote areas in the islands that may not have access to more metropolitan type of services. The reality of loss that's in is a diminished assistance leading to abandonment. So if I think there was news stories, and I don't know sometimes whether these are accurate or not. But there's a lot of stuff going out there, and to quote, it might be fake news, some of these things. So we got to be careful with what we're reading, and don't assume that they're getting all these supplies. Assume they're not, because most of the time they're not getting these supplies, and it might be in a container somewhere waiting to be distributed throughout the island, and most likely it's not. One of the most important things, people are being very kind and opening their hearts and buying gift cards, which is awesome. There's no electricity to be able to run those cards. So I would humbly ask you to perhaps consider sending a cash donation. And I think there's a setup here at the university, if you're generous, and I know you're generous, but if you're willing to do that type of help, it will be more helpful to the families because they can buy their goods a lot quicker because of the lack of electricity in the area. So the reconstruction phase of a disaster, it's a long-term process. I'm not sure how many of you were living in the area when Hurricane Andrew hit. That was 25 years ago. I was 5 years old when that storm came. I was a little bit older than 5 years old.
Yeah, right. 5 years.
Cut the camera, please. Can we edit that part, please? But when Hurricane Andrew came, it was a much more condensed storm, but the damage was enormous. And stories say that there was 2 tornadoes that were spun from that hurricane going 200 miles an hour. And the Homestead area, there was most of the homes had no paint on it because it had been pressure washed away with the tornadoes, not to mention roofs and trailer parks, and the death toll was a lot higher than what the public was told, a lot higher. But we won't go back and recruit anybody here too much farther. But the process of rebuilding, when you drove through that area, you thought this can never come back to normal, ever. And if you drive through the Hurricane Andrew areas in Homestead, you can't even tell there was a hurricane there anymore, which is amazing. So the fact of the matter is, we've come a long way, and it takes a while to rebuild. So there's ongoing struggles with agencies and funding, which will happen. And certainly a lot of agencies in Puerto Rico, when they get up and running again, will be able to provide more specific and localized help. But sometimes to get them back and running is going to be an issue because their employees, their team members are also affected. And they may not be on the island anymore. They might have been part of the exodus that we're expecting might come to Orlando, Miami. They're preparing for families already in Atlanta as well, just to make sure that they don't also overtax an area in the state of Florida. So, and reconstruction requires commitment, and we have a lot of it here. But it requires commitment from the community and agencies as well, of course, and adjusting to the new normal. Just like we're talking about, you driving home is no longer the normal that you were remembering before the hurricane. It's a new normal for you, so you have to get used to more sunlight than shade. You have to get used to less ornate landscaping than you were used to. So we have to kind of create a new level of comfort with those familiar roads that we normally take back home and to work or school. So that'll be part of it. And most people will rebuild, and they'll discover a new meaning to things, and things get back to normal. We're a very resilient species, humans. Also very destructive, but mostly resilient, which is a good thing, right? So some secondary adversities that happen when you have a disaster is a compound trauma of losing a home, cherished belongings, and it doesn't make sense to us because we might have some things, but if someone very special to you gave you an article that meant the world to you, and that's destroyed and no longer available, a sense of comfort is gone, right? Not to mention the home, a loss of social, a loss of family ties. A lot of families break up and then have a lot of dysfunction because of these moments. Like those family members who didn't call you to come over to their house when they had lights, and you were sweating it for about 7 days. Yeah, you might not, the Christmas cards may not be as affluent this year and coming as usual, right? Because we develop a sense of resentment for not having been accepted and invited, right? Loss of self-esteem, loss of control over your life, loss of resources, like we mentioned, the food and the money in Puerto Rico. So if you get some cash, it would be greatly appreciated. And a lot of abilities. Sometimes, I'm a little bit over 20, a little bit. So my agility is not the same that it was. My agility isn't the same as it was when I was 15, when I was 20, right? So I have to also kind of pace myself and measure. In a moment where things are going on, you forget how old you are. I'm just going to do what needs to be happening. But we get limits. So the elderly are quite affected by this storm. And the elderly can't clean the rubbish from their yards. The elderly can't maybe clean the damage that happened with the flooding like maybe you can quickly do. So oftentimes they're left for last. Oftentimes because of shame, because of not wanting to be a burden, they don't say that they have these needs. So we have to take those things into consideration as well. So some reactions to a disaster, you're going to have trouble concentrating. So people are going to call you and not remember certain particular details. People are going to have trouble forgetting or rather remembering certain things because stress affects our memory areas, memory centers in the brain. So when you have chronic stress, it's even more impacting, right? So they can have difficulty making a decision. So perhaps you give them 3 great resources, but they just don't know what to do. What do I do, and how do I call these people? And how do I perform the task of connecting with those needs that I have? Even though the resources are available, sometimes we have to walk them through. So please exercise a lot of patience and maybe repetition because it might be necessary because of these reactions. So there's a preoccupation and almost like an obsessive quality to thinking about the disaster, and that's all they talk about. If you ever had a family member that may have been in the military, that may have been through a war, that's all they talk about, right? And the elderly, sometimes because they're in that Ericksonian phase of just reviewing, wisdom versus despair, right? So they're kind of going through their life and thinking about all that used to be, and sometimes they keep reviewing those moments where they just didn't, where they could have, should have, would have done something different, and they didn't. So they get to that phase where they kind of stay stuck. So the elderly are going to have a lot more preoccupation. with the storm. The younger people tend to, like us, tend to move forward, right? And kind of get past it and keep going. And it helps us because we can stay busy. When you're retired and have nothing to do, all you have to do is think about stuff, right? And we have, on average, about 60,000 thoughts a day. So if 10% of those are negative, that's 6,000 negative thoughts. If you have nothing else to think about except the storm and the destruction and the change around you, that's a lot of bombardment of stress for this person. You're going to often get, of course, a lot of nightmares. Your subconscious trying to work out whatever the heck happened and trying to figure out what occurred, why did this happen. Increased alcohol, usually talked about feelings of depression, irritability, and sadness, of course, tiredness, low energy for no reason. There's a reason. Even though you're inactive, if you're active up here and your subconscious trying to process things and trying to come to terms with losses, you're active. You may not be physically active, but the mental activity is huge, and it's exhausting. In fact, depression is one of the most emotionally taxing and draining of all the mental health disorders, and it's the one that oftentimes exhibits the least activity because we're sitting at home in a dark room with the covers over us, maybe sleeping a lot. So not a lot of physical activity, but a lot of mental and emotional activity up here. So it's very draining. So don't assume that because someone's not active that they're not tired, okay? Because they might be processing a lot. And of course, in my case, when I get stressed, the increase is very good for appetite for me. So yeah, so my hurricane food didn't last as long as I would have wanted it to. But it's okay. So taking a crisis call. Any questions so far? So crisis calls and a hotline will come sometimes in an emergency. So sometimes we have to be prepared for an emergency call and know what to do. And for those of you who will be signing on, and thank you ahead of time, and thank you for just even being here and considering. But for those of you who are going to be on with a little bit more intensive and extensive training to be able to manage and handle these things, there's going to be a script for you to be able to help you through the process. You have to like come out of nowhere and just come up with something to say. So we'll prepare you for it, okay? And it's also good in your own particular private practices or in your agency so that if it happens, and it most likely will, you'll be prepared to handle that and deal with that and just kind of feel more comfortable in the response. They might be calling for referrals and information, and you may not have information. But if you promise someone, listen, I'll look it up for you, look it up for them. Not at that moment. You could say, may I have your number and I'll call you back as soon as I get this information. And you could do that, or you could maybe direct them, like for example, here, if the person that calls you is in Miami-Dade County, we have that 211 number, right? Which is the old switchboard of man, which is now handled by the Jewish Family Services, right? So a wonderful place to refer. So if you have any questions, you could maybe call for them or just direct them there. And of course, a lot of people call for emotional support just to be listened to. Now, they might not always be pleasant when they call you. They might be angry. They might think that this hotline is some sort of monetary handout number. So when am I getting my FEMA check? Right? Because a lot of people are looking for the FEMA check. Right? And we might need to educate them when they call in and ask us those questions very patiently and kindly. That this is not the type of number. However, let me look that up for you if you don't have it available. We're going to have a lot of resources for you, by the way, in lists and things so that you could give them those numbers. So we will be having a lot of referral numbers and things that you can do, but sometimes you may not have that number. If you commit to finding that number for them, find that number for them. And if you try to find that number and you can't, you call them and say, listen, I've made a lot of efforts to find it and I can't find that number. Maybe the 211 people will have it for you. Maybe calling your local community government office will have that number for you. So help them, because they may not, while it comes easy to you because you're just really good about being agile and your thinking and problem solving, they're in a state of distress, right? So they're not going to have that agility that you have, right? So be careful with that. There's three major stages of a crisis. We begin with the rising tension, like maybe midterms coming up soon, so a little tension right there, not necessarily crisis, but tension rises, right? And then we have a rise in anxiety, and sometimes maybe there's an injury. There's a point of being confused, so when it rises beyond and higher than tension, we have a lot of these overwhelming feelings of helplessness, of anger, and not having what we feel is enough coping mechanisms and strategies to handle what's coming. That's what creates a crisis. If you have resources, if you had a second home somewhere that didn't get hit, you just move to a second home. Right? Some family members left the state of Florida and went to New York and stayed there for a week or two, which is great. No one called me, by the way, to invite me over, but in any case, if you have resources, you have coping strategies, you don't get as effective. But if you have limited funds, if you have a big caravan of family members, you just can't pop into some hotel because you may not have the money for that. So some people had to weather the storm, and that's where you get a lot of the rising anxiety and the overwhelming feelings. And finally, there's an inability to find suitable, we've talked about this, but inability to find suitable coping skills to manage and deal with the crisis, and they resort to different coping strategies. One of them might be calling you guys, if we're fortunate. Sometimes they go to desperate measures. Desperate times calls for desperate measures, right? And oftentimes, that's what they'll resort to, desperate things. So it's not uncommon that in a crisis like this, there might be looting. The looters aren't bad people. The behavior is not desirable, but it's because there might be a level of desperation that's going on there. So if I could ask you to humbly withhold your judgment, because we're not in those people's shoes. Right? So I'm not sure exactly what's going on at the moment. It's certainly a disaster. People tend to get very overwhelmed, and they'll resort to drastic measures because of their limited ability to cope with things. Okay? So what is the caller feeling when they're calling? They're going to feel anxiety, right? They're going to feel, this is the one that's most often listed by the caller. You're going to see it in rapid speech. You're going to see it in sometimes pressured speech. You're going to see it because they jump from topic to topic, right? It's produced by a substantial threat to their overall well-being. We get anxious because we feel we can't cope with what we're feeling and can't cope with what we're fearful of having, right? There's an old, it's a really good book. It's an old book called, it's an old book called, there's Instant Happy is one of the books, and the other one is How to Be Happy, Damn It. Very good author, Karen Salmonson. And in the book, Instant Happy, which is her second book, rather a later book, Karen Salmonson says that if you want to be sad, live in the past. If you want to be anxious, live in the future. If you want to be peaceful, you live in the moment. So we, as a call center, we have to help that person to be in the moment and stay here. Not go into the future and, but what if I can't have, and what if I don't have money? And what if I have something to get rebuilt? We try to keep them gently in the moment. But you have your family with you. You guys are together. You guys have, weathered the storm. You survived this. And one of the anecdotal statements that I make sometimes to a client is that, when they're overwhelmed, is I remind them, listen, you're a survivor. You have survived everything that has ever happened to you. In fact, everyone in this room and on Facebook is a survivor because you have survived everything that's ever happened to you. You're alive, you're here in front of me and online somewhere. So the fact of the matter is, because you are here and online somewhere, you're proof positive you have survived everything. And something we're so busy doing and so busy worrying, we don't realize that we're accomplishing. And survival is very important. So you have a lot of skills that have gotten you this far. And so have your callers. Sometimes reminding them of that is very helpful. So sometimes anxiety will be quite severe and produce confusion, judgments distorted, distortions in how they normally do things, different bizarre behaviors might result from it, right? And it's an emotion that we're going to also deal with most often, and oftentimes they might elicit in us. So as you're receiving a call, let me remind you to breathe. And I don't mean just regular breath, because clearly you're doing that too. But it's the breath that helps us kind of manage all that we're kind of collecting in that moment. Okay, and we'll talk about that breath in a little bit. So keep breathing normal until further notice. All right, so another feeling we have is helplessness. In a moment of helplessness, when that caller calls you, their internal and external events are piling up. So not just all that's happened outside, all the losses, the lack of electricity, the lack of food and resources, but all those fears are piling up. So they have this enormous mountain of problems they have to solve, or they're giving themselves a task of solving alone, and then of course they deal with that helplessness, which we sometimes, if we're not careful, even with all our resources, will also often experience. Many times they feel guilty, even for calling, when so many other people are worse off. And there's something called survival guilt. And why did it come?
Yeah, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, agree with me often. I like that. So survival guilt is what we experience sometimes because, why are we okay here? And all those poor people in Puerto Rico had to experience that. So we feel guilty that we have AC. And if we have family there, we feel more guilty because we try to get them over, but they're refusing, right? Because they just want to stay in their familiar surroundings, right? So it's difficult. So we're going to have a sense of that guilt, right? And they're also may not be able to see choices, they call it when they call you, and they really depend on us to help them jump through the decision-making process and give them those resources. So not knowing that something exists will oftentimes, you being the one connecting factor to that, the bridge to that help, is going to be relieving a lot of their feelings of helplessness, of course. Anger. Is anger a bad emotion? No, it's not a bad emotion. We need it. It's a motivating emotion. When anger turns to rage, not so good. Right? And that's what that was happening a lot in the Florida Power Light call center, because they were getting a lot of death threats. See, but just in case you ever want to know, if you call Florida Power Light because you have no lights, and you give them a death threat, you are immediately removed to the bottom of the list. And then they have, literally, and then they have to go with the police officer to attend to what's going on in your home, which might involve an arrest. I'm just saying. So please, if you ever have no lights, resort to other methods of voicing your frustration, right? So the caller might be very angry, might be upset that nothing is happening to the speed that they wish it would happen, and you're the only person who's going to be listening. It's not about you. They're not mad at you. They're not angry at you, but you're the only person who's going to give them that ability of time to listen. So give them a minute to rant and rave. Don't interrupt them. Give them about a minute to rant and rave if they're going off on you, right? And just listen. And sometimes an occasional, yes sir, I understand, yes ma'am, I can't imagine how difficult that must be. And just on occasion, just let them know that you're listening. Because if you don't, are you still there? Are you listening to me? So you want to make sure that you don't fuel the anger, but rather let them know that you're listening. And at the end of that minute, they tend to kind of de-escalate a little bit, and then you can kind of intercede with your suggestions and advice, right? So it's going to be directed toward the event, not you. It's directed inward oftentimes, and oftentimes, you know, anger and sadness are the same emotion, sort of, right? So angry sadness turned outward. You want everyone else to feel as bad as you do. That's what an angry person does. Wants everyone else to hurt as bad as they're hurt, right? And sadness and anger turn inward, become very self-defeating. And oftentimes in that self-defeat, you know, we kind of do things that hurt us. So that's where anger and sadness are the same. It's a legitimate emotion, and it's often one that needs to be expressed, right? However, if it becomes hostile and it becomes something that becomes above and beyond what's typically normal for us, I'm going to teach you in the more extensive training how to deal and process that. And you don't have to be berated. You know, your job doesn't, and your volunteer time doesn't mean that you must take all the F-bombs that that person can throw at you, right? Well, if Pino had to, you guys do not. Right? So oftentimes you can also have ambivalence in the caller. So the decision to call the crisis line often comes out of desperation, last-ditch hope at getting some sort of assistance, right? There's an inward struggle of wanting to be independent, but needing something, but not being able to provide it. So there's a struggle that they kind of have to process. So maybe reassure them when they call in. A caller who's also in crisis is going to be impulsively releasing emotions too without thinking through. Because if you're their bridge to help, you know, why are they going to shoot the messenger or the possible bridge of getting assistance? So they oftentimes don't think beyond that. And of course, ambivalence is a form of defense mechanism just to kind of protect their feelings. So they become distant, and they become just kind of, you know, like a wall. And there's no way to even read emotions if you were with them in person. So as an advocate, as a hotline advocate, your role is going to be one of support, providing support. You know, give them empathetic but not judgmental support. They don't need an assessment at that moment. They just need a caring ear, right? So be a good listener. Maybe relieve some of that person's emotion that's distressing them. Giving them an opportunity to express themselves. Be a clarifier, right? So sometimes address, so what's most taxing to you, sir, ma'am, is, and you kind of reiterate what they were telling you. So what's most pressing for you is, and if I can help you perhaps, it would be with, and you kind of clarify what they're calling about. Because sometimes, remember, they're a bit scattered and they go all over the place, and then you don't know what the heck they called for anymore. So then you want to kind of help them, when they have difficulty making decisions, being clear, so you want to help them be a little bit more direct, right? So, and your role as an advocate is also going to be one of providing information and referrals. You're not here to solve their problems. So let me here at this moment interject. I want you please to consider yourself a lighthouse, not a lifeboat. So I want you please to consider yourself as a person that's going to get them to what they need. If you have, and a lot of us clinicians that come into this field have a lifeboat complex. We want to save everybody. So jump in, I'll do the rowing, I'll do the fixing, right? And what we do inadvertently is not give the person that we're carrying in our boat, driving around in our boat, rowing around in our boat rather, we don't give them or help them get the tools to make it on their own. We create dependencies, right? So be a lighthouse, not a lifeboat when you're an advocate hotline caller, okay? Hotline operator, we'll call you an operator. So remember, you can't change others or make them get help, but your job is to give them advice. Your role is to delineate options for the caller and help them regain some sort of sense of control. Sometimes even just having been heard is that. Let me go real quick here. By relieving some of the anxiety, helping the caller to regain the control, and by reassuring that caller that there are choices in any situation, you can direct the caller to more realistic problem-solving behaviors. Following here are going to be some slides on suicide calls. I'm going to reserve those for the advanced training. So, and it won't be this short either, it's going to be more advanced. So I just kind of include them in this PowerPoint just to kind of review them. So bear with me when we get to that. I'm going to just go through it quickly, right? So how to handle a crisis call. I'm going to ask you to be yourself. Please don't be Florence Nightingale. Please don't be Sigmund Freud. Please don't be, the most amazing, hotline person ever, because, what I want you to be is yourself. Because if you're somebody else, you're not going to remember, and you're not going to feel comfortable. So in a world where you can be anybody, be yourself. Everyone else is already taken, right? So be you. Right? Try to speak in a calm voice. If you have a tendency to become anxious, speak slowly. Right? So speak in a very calming voice, much like you would speak to maybe a baby who's falling asleep and you want to reassure the baby. You wouldn't go, "Go to sleep, buddy, pal." You want to ask. I'm sorry if I woke some of you guys going taking a nap, but you want to make sure that that child is soothed. So you're doing it with your voice. You're kind of becoming hypnotic in the process of talking to that person. Okay? Control your breathing. Try to breathe slowly. Let me go here and talk about the kind of breath I'd like for you to consider on occasion as you're taking these phone calls. Okay? So if you take a deep breath right now, and go ahead and just do it really quick, what part of your body expands? For most people, it's the chest, right? That's a wonderful breath. You've been doing it all your life. But there's a better breath than that. It's a diaphragm breath, right? And most of us clinicians know it, right? So I did this for a group of little kids that work a lot with trauma with children. And I was doing this, a cute little second grader said that I looked at the letter B when I was breathing. So I don't know what that means. So I'm striving for the letter I eventually one day, but right now I'm a B, lowercase b. So let me go ahead and show you the breath with just the chest. Let me show you the diaphragm breath here. Don't get scared, we're trained professionals. For those of you on Facebook, do not adjust your sets or computers. This is just a breathing into mic. So what that does is it saturates your brain when you do the diaphragmatic breath. It saturates your brain with oxygen. And the very thing that makes us anxious and that causes us anxious is that shallowness of breathing. When we're anxious, when we're working on something, when we're tired or stressed about something, we breathe very shallow. So our brain starts freaking out because it's not getting oxygen. So in taking that deep breath in, and holding it, you saturate your brain with the oxygen. And expelling it slowly and holding it, what you do is you also relax the vagus nerve that goes from your brain to your heart to your stomach. It's that knots in your stomach. So if you've ever been in a stressful situation and you just keep going, you don't give yourself any sort of relief, you tend to sometimes automatically go, you may have been doing a lot of that now. That's your vagus nerve saying, please relax the stomach. I'm going nuts over here. And it's full of knots. So you tend to kind of do the when we're stressed because you want to relax that nervous feeling in your stomach, right? So I'm also going to ask you please to just listen. Let the person unload. Let the person talk. Use the caller's name. So we're going to also have a little sheet for you to get certain pertinent information from the caller's calling so you don't forget the person's name. The last thing they want you to call them is something different than their name. So we're going to have little things kind of set up to make it easier for you and very natural like to the caller when they call in, okay? And be empathetic. Remember, no judgments. Normalize what's happening to the person and what they're feeling. Oftentimes, this might be the first episode in experience with anxiety or depression that's pronounced. So this might be their first disaster that they go through and all the losses that they experience. So normalize please what they're feeling. Assure the caller that everything's going to remain confidential. We're not going to, get this to the press, get this to the news. Avoid arguing with the person. When the caller has expressed a thought, pause for a few seconds before responding. You don't have to have, sometimes the best form of communication is silence. So sometimes just being quiet is great. For those of you who have a spouse or partner, you'd wish they'd also pick up on that skill. Right? So use open-ended questions, and please tell me how you feel how you felt when this was happening. How do you feel now? And oftentimes, and remember, we're going to have a script for you, so don't worry about memorizing these things. I just want to get your mind geared in that direction. Speak to the caller's feelings, like their feelings of loneliness in the situation that they're experiencing. We're going to remain in control of our own feelings when we're doing this, so you can be objective and helpful to them. We're going to relate the problem and the feelings in a simple way. It's not as if you're feeling the old active listening that we all learn. Right? Don't give solutions. If I were you, I'd call FEMA to give them a piece of mind. You don't do that. What we're really doing is helping them come up with a solution. So just be present, be in the moment, and help them come to their conclusions. This is not your experience. This is their experience. Right? And they're being kind and generous enough to kind of be vulnerable enough to call. So remember that they don't have to share with you, but they're choosing and they're willing to share with you. You have to be appreciative of that, and that should come out in your voice. Find out when the caller has done, and what he or she can do for them. So, what have you done so far, or who have you called so far, and kind of help them kind of through and kind of get some sort of inventory of what's been done, and support the effort. Will you call back and let me know how it worked out for you, please? Or can you call us back and let us know? And if you can, maybe we can incorporate this. Maybe if they give us permission, we could do a follow-up at some point, or some other operator can do a follow-up. Hey, listen, you called our center. Thank you for giving us permission to be able to call you. How are you doing? How's it going? Okay. So ask closed-ended questions when you want to assess danger, assess safety options, gather basic information. But you're going to ask open-ended questions. Okay, we're going to go past you. We're going to ask open-ended questions. We want them to elaborate. So, like I said, we're going to kind of go through the suicide call. We're going to get to the promise. But in helping us, thank you. But I want you to remember 10 things in helping you cope with stress. Okay? You might want to offer to them, but I want you to remember these 10 things. Exercise, right? So walk. Walking is the easiest form of exercise. I go by my gym twice a day. I drive right by it twice a day. But I feel much better. I really do. So use a lot of exercise. Okay? Walk around. Spend time with others. So, I don't have any friends. Okay, well then go to Barnes and Noble and sit there. Get a cup of coffee, get a cup of tea. You don't have to talk to nobody, but just be around people. Because oftentimes we kind of isolate into our own safety, what we call a sanctuary, and it's really a prison. And the only person that's holding the key to the door is you. So please be around other people, right? Eventually you'll make friends. So reach out to others, right? So call family members, call friends. Hey, how you doing? How was the storm for you? And do that kind of stuff, right? Okay, stay calm. Things happen, okay? Stay calm. Overreacting is not going to change things, right? I don't know what's going to happen here, but try to eat a healthy diet. This is one resourceful theory, okay? Try to eat healthy as best you can. Not all the time. Sometimes we need comfort food. I need comfort food 23 hours out of the day. So I do sometimes like boil a kale leaf and drink it, but that's very rare for me. Okay? Do things that make you feel good. So if you have pets, be kind to your pets and nurture them, walk them. Maybe go to a pet store, maybe walk around nature, go to the beach if you like the beach. Do things that make you feel good. Okay? Use the power of prayer. If you have a faith that you're connected to, and if you don't, and you would rather change the word prayer for meditation, you can. If you want to change the word of prayer to say affirmation, you can. Whatever is right and feels right to you, really tap into that. Because oftentimes you do a lot of helping and a lot of healing, but leave yourself for last. So this is a very wonderful way to kind of regroup and recharge, and we oftentimes don't take as much advantage of it as we could. Get plenty of rest. Please get plenty of rest. It's important. Remember, you're not crazy because you're feeling certain things, right? We're going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to feel anxious. You're going to feel angry. You're not perfect. If you're one of those stoic therapists that feel nothing, then you're not really an effective therapist. I'm not saying freak out in front of your clients. Please don't ever do that. But keep yourself in check. But know that your feelings are normal. And talk to friends. Talk to friends. It's important to do that. Relate and you know, express with your friends. Before you talk to friends, let me ask you, please, not to slime your friends. Okay, what I mean by that is, in compassion fatigue, there's something that we sometimes do we're not aware of, or we're kind of busy working maybe in an agency. Oh my God, these mothers and these parents and these kids and these stuff. And sometimes we're so overwhelmed. The last thing we need is for someone to slime us with all their crap. Right? So be cautious when you're talking to a friend. If you want to keep your friends, say, listen, do you have a minute, or can I process something with you? Or even if you have a colleague at work, listen, I just had a really bad session. Are you available? Can we talk a little bit about this? Do you mind? And get there okay before you start sliming them with all your garbage. Right? So compassion fatigue is very powerful. We get compassion fatigue and burnout not because we're uncaring and ineffective. We get it because we're very caring and very effective. But you also have to consider yourself in that balance. So make sure to take these 10 top things into account. So please indicate your willingness to volunteer. 2 hours to assist at the hotline, and Dr. Alonso made mention to that. We have, I think, a list going around. If you could please indicate that you're interested, and I'll certainly send you this PowerPoint as well. For further information, will be made available to you guys. If you're going to be interested, we're going to do some more extensive stuff, particularly to the call. And I want to thank you for your time and listening. Thank you. Any questions? Any donations you want to make to me? And if you do want to make donations to the police, and I hope you do at one point when you can, when you're comfortable, make sure if you feel comfortable, you'll get a receipt here, make it cash so those families have access to that. Okay, because the cards are not as effective for them right now as they normally would be. Okay. Thank you. Yeah,
Dr. Perron,
yes.
You'll be emailing me the scripts and the.
I will be emailing you the scripts and the
PowerPoint presentation.
And the PowerPoint presentation. Yes.
Right. And then a sheet you said you were going to.
There's a sheet that I think is going to. Is there not a sheet?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. This sheet is a sign-in sheet with all the information, so I'll be sending, if you put your information here, if you didn't, please let us know, so that we could email you the PowerPoint presentation as well. We'll gladly do that. Okay. But yeah, we'll be having scripts and some policies and stuff in place just to kind of help the person feel more comfortable in the process of answering those phone calls. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Facebook. People appreciate that.
Okay, so remember, one of the things, there's a sheet going around the room. Those of you that